Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the massive window of her assigned quarters and stared out at the city below. The Velrothi capital stretched across the horizon like a forest of silver towers and golden domes. She had been on this alien world for exactly 3 days, and everything still felt like a dream. Sarah was a xenobiologist from Earth. At 32 years old, she had spent most of her adult life studying alien life forms through data screens and research papers. Now she was actually here, standing on an alien planet, about to work with an alien species face to face. It was everything she had ever wanted. It was also terrifying. The Velrothi were not what most humans expected when they thought of aliens. They looked like large cats that walked on 2 legs. Their fur came in shades of silver, gold, and copper. They had long tails that moved with their emotions and ears that swiveled to catch every sound. They were taller than humans, more muscular, and moved with a grace that made Sarah feel clumsy in comparison. But the most striking thing about the Velrothi was not how they looked. It was how they acted. They were formal, distant, and followed rules for everything. There were rules for how to greet someone, rules for how to stand in a room, rules for which doors you could use and which ones you could not. Sarah had spent her first 2 days just trying to remember all the protocols. Her liaison officer, a Velrothi named Kortvan, had explained it simply. "We are an old species, Dr. Chen. We have order. We have structure. This is how we have survived for 50,000 years. Sarah had nodded politely, but privately she found it all exhausting. Back on Earth, you could just say hello to someone without worrying if you bowed at the correct angle. She was here as part of a cultural exchange program. Humanity had joined the Galactic Coalition only 5 years ago. They were the newcomers, the junior species, the ones everyone else looked at with curiosity and sometimes concern. Humans were considered fragile by most standards, too soft, too emotional, too quick to bond with things they should not bond with. The Velrothi, on the other hand, were one of the founding members of the coalition. They controlled 17 star systems and had a military that other species respected and feared. When the Velrothi offered to host a human researcher at their imperial palace, Earth's government had accepted immediately. It was a huge honor. Sarah's assignment was specific. She was to study Velrothi child-rearing practices and write a comparative report. The research would help humans understand how different species raise their young, which could improve diplomatic relations and educational exchanges. On her 4th day, Kortvan took her to the Palace Nursery Observation Center. It was not the actual nursery, he explained. It was a room filled with screens that showed live feeds from the real nursery. "You understand that direct contact with cubs is restricted," Kortvan said as they walked down a long corridor. "They are dangerous at that age. Their instincts have not yet developed full control. They bite, they scratch, they attack without warning." Sarah frowned. "How young are we talking?" "From birth to approximately 4 solar years," Kortvan replied. "During this time, they must be handled only by specialized caretakers who wear protective gear." "Protective gear? To handle children?" Kortvan's ears flicked in what Sarah had learned was mild irritation. "They are not children, Dr. Chen. They are cubs." "There is a difference. Cubs are wild things that must be civilized. It takes time and discipline." The observation room was cold and clinical. A dozen screens showed different angles of a large, sterile chamber. Sarah could see 3 small Velrothi cubs in the space. They looked like miniature versions of the adults, with oversized heads and unsteady gaits. They were alone in the room, which was filled with educational toys and soft platforms. As Sarah watched, one of the cubs opened its mouth and made a loud, distressed sound. The cry echoed through the speakers. Another cub joined in, then the third. They called and called, pacing around the room. "Is that normal?" Sarah asked. "Completely," Kortvan said without concern. "Cubs vocalize frequently. It is how they develop their communication skills." Sarah was not convinced. She had studied animal behavior for years, and those cries did not sound like practice. They sounded like distress calls. The cubs were calling for someone who was not coming. Over the next week, Sarah spent hours watching the nursery feeds. She took detailed notes on the cubs' behavior patterns. They ate alone from automated feeders. They played alone with their toys. Twice a day, a caretaker entered wearing thick padded armor that covered them from head to toe. The caretaker would check the cubs' health, clean them efficiently, and leave. The entire process took less than 10 minutes. The cubs always tried to follow the caretaker to the door. They reached out with their small paws. They made soft chirping sounds. The caretaker never responded except to gently push them back before sealing the door. Sarah mentioned her observations to Kortvan during one of their daily meetings. The cubs seem lonely. They show classic signs of social deprivation. Kortvan's tail swished. Dr. Chen, I understand that humans raise their young differently. You keep them close, perhaps too close. But Velrothi cubs must learn independence early. We do not coddle weakness. But they're babies, Sarah protested. They are cubs, Kortvan corrected firmly. And this conversation is becoming inappropriate. You are here to observe and document, not to judge. Sarah bit back her response. She was a guest here. She had to remember that. She learned more about the nursery by asking careful questions to other palace staff. The cubs in the main nursery were the children of noble families. The three she watched most closely were the children of the Empress herself. They were being raised according to the highest standards of Velrothi tradition. The elite guard who were assigned to protect the nursery were considered the best of the best. It was a posting that brought great honor. Warriors competed for years to earn the position. Once selected, they served a 5-year term, watching over the cubs day and night. Sarah met Commander Thelrix briefly in a hallway one day. He was a massive Velrothi with copper-colored fur and numerous military decorations braided into his mane. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, but there was something else there too. Something that looked like exhaustion. Commander, Sarah greeted him with a respectful nod. He returned the gesture. Dr. Chen, I trust your research is progressing well. Yes, thank you. The cubs are fascinating. Something flickered across Thelrix's face. Indeed, they are the future of our empire. He continued down the hall, but Sarah noticed his shoulders were tense. His tail held too still. She had learned that Velrothi tails were like emotional barometers. They moved freely when a Velrothi was relaxed. When they were held rigid, it meant the person was under stress. What kind of stress came from guarding cubs in a locked room? Sarah could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. The more she watched the feeds, the more certain she became. The cubs were developing, yes. They were learning and growing, but they were also suffering in a way that seemed so obvious to her. They needed touch. They needed comfort. They needed someone to respond when they cried. But this was not Earth, this was not her culture. She was just an observer, or at least that was what she kept telling herself as she lay awake at night, haunted by the sound of those small, lonely cries. The alarm started screaming at 2 a.m, station time. Sarah jolted awake in her quarters, her heart pounding. The sound was deafening, a piercing wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Red lights flashed in the hallway outside her door. She grabbed her datapad and checked the emergency alert. Fire in the East Wing. All personnel evacuate to designated assembly points. Sarah threw on her clothes and rushed into the corridor. Palace staff and guards were already moving in organized groups toward the exits. A Velrothi guard gestured sharply at her. This way, human! Quickly! She followed the flow of people down a main staircase. The palace was enormous, and she had only learned a few routes during her short time here. Smoke was beginning to drift through some corridors. The sharp smell made her eyes water. Keep moving, someone shouted. Sarah descended 3 flights of stairs with a group of palace workers. They emerged into a large courtyard where others were already gathering. Officials were checking names on lists, counting people, organizing groups. But something was wrong. Sarah could hear raised voices near the palace entrance. A group of guards was arguing, their tails lashing with agitation. The East Wing connects to the nursery corridor. One was saying, We need to verify the seals. The cubs are secure, another replied. The nursery has independent life support. But the guards were pulled to help with evacuation. Protocol demands all available personnel assist. Sarah's blood went cold. The cubs were alone? During a fire? She looked around. Everyone was focused on the evacuation, on counting personnel, on following emergency procedures. No one was thinking about 3 small cubs who must be terrified by the alarms. She should not do anything. It was not her place. The cubs had security systems. The nursery was designed to be safe. But she could not stop thinking about those cries she heard every day. Those small paws reaching for a caretaker who never stayed. Sarah moved slowly to the edge of the crowd. No one was watching her. Everyone was too busy with the emergency. She slipped back toward a side entrance, her heart hammering. The palace corridors were mostly empty now. Emergency lighting cast everything in a red glow. Sarah tried to remember the layout. The nursery was in the western wing, which should be away from the fire. But how did you get there from here? She took a left turn, then a right. The hallway looked familiar. She had walked this way with Kortvan during her second day. Or had that been a different corridor? Everything looked the same in the emergency lighting. Sarah turned another corner and found herself in a hallway she definitely recognized. There was the observation room where she spent her days, which meant the actual nursery was. She walked further and found a door marked with Velrothi symbols. Her translator implant rendered them as nursery chamber, authorized personnel only. She should turn back. She should return to the courtyard. This was against every protocol. Through the door she could hear crying. The cubs were crying, their voices high and frightened. Sarah's hand moved to the door panel before she could think about it. To her surprise, it opened. The locks must have disengaged during the emergency evacuation. Safety protocols would not trap anyone inside during a fire. The nursery was larger than it looked on the screens. The lighting was softer here, easier on young eyes. Educational toys were scattered across the floor. Climbing platforms stood against the walls. And in the center of the room, 3 small Velrothi cubs huddled together crying. They saw her immediately. Their crying stopped for a moment, replaced by cautious silence. They stared at her with wide golden eyes. Sarah knew she should be afraid. Everyone said the cubs were dangerous. They attacked without warning. Their claws could shred flesh. But all she saw were 3 frightened babies. She sat down slowly on the floor, making herself smaller. Less threatening. She had worked with frightened animals before, back on Earth. The principles were the same. Move slowly. Speak softly. Let them come to you. Hey there, she said quietly. It's okay. The alarms are scary, aren't they? But you're safe. Everything's going to be okay. The cubs watched her. Their ears swiveled, tracking her voice. One of them took a hesitant step forward. It was the smallest one, with silver fur that gleamed in the soft light. Sarah kept talking, her voice low and soothing. She told them about Earth, about her cat back home, about anything that came to mind. The content did not matter. It was the tone that counted, calm, safe, gentle. The silver cub crept closer. Its nose twitched, scenting her. Then very carefully it touched her knee with one small paw. Sarah held perfectly still. The cub climbed into her lap. The other 2 watched this with apparent amazement. If a cub's expression could show surprise, theirs did. After a moment, they also moved closer. One curled up against her side. The other pressed against her leg. They were warm and soft. Their fur was silkier than she expected. They made small chirping sounds, no longer cries of fear, but something else. Something that sounded almost like purring. Sarah found herself stroking their fur gently. They leaned into the touch, their small bodies relaxing. The one in her lap kneaded its paws against her shirt, claws carefully sheathed. You're not dangerous at all, are you? She whispered. You're just lonely. The cubs snuggled closer. The alarms were still going, but they seemed to have stopped caring. They had found something more important than fear. They had found comfort. Sarah leaned back against one of the platforms. She would stay just a few more minutes, just until they calmed down, just until the emergency was over and the guards returned. But the past week had been exhausting. The stress of being on an alien world, of following endless protocols, of watching those sad little cubs every day, it had all taken a toll. The adrenaline from the fire alarm was fading now. The cubs were warm against her. Their purring was soothing. Sarah's eyes grew heavy. Just for a moment, she thought. I'll just close my eyes for a moment. She did not mean to fall asleep. She definitely did not mean to stay asleep. But her body had other ideas. Within minutes, she was dreaming, completely unaware of where she was or what she was doing. The cubs felt her relax. They burrowed closer, seeking her warmth. One draped itself across her lap. Another tucked itself under her arm. The third curled against her side, its small head resting on her ribs. For the first time since they had been separated from their mother, the cubs felt safe. This strange, soft creature smelled wrong and looked wrong and made odd sounds. But she was warm. She was gentle. And most importantly, she stayed. The cubs' stress hormones, which had been elevated for weeks, began to drop. Their heart rate slowed to normal resting levels. Their breathing deepened. Within 10 minutes of Sarah falling asleep, all 3 cubs were also sleeping. The nursery's monitoring system recorded everything. Bioscanners tracked the cubs' vital signs and noted the improvements. Cameras captured the image of a human woman sleeping peacefully with three supposedly dangerous Velrothi cubs draped across her like living blankets. The Palace AI analyzed the situation and found no threat. The cubs were safe. Their vital signs were excellent. The human's biosigns showed she was simply sleeping, not unconscious from injury or illness. There was no reason to raise an alarm. In the courtyard outside, firefighting teams brought the blaze under control. It had been a kitchen fire, quickly contained. Within an hour, the all-clear was given. Personnel began returning to their posts. Commander Thelrix and his elite guard detail were among the first to return. They had helped evacuate staff from near the fire zone, their training and discipline making them invaluable during the emergency. Now Thelrix's mind was on the cubs. They would be frightened from the alarms. He quickened his pace toward the nursery, his team following close behind. He reached the nursery door and palmed the lock. It opened smoothly. He stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the softer lighting. What he saw made him freeze in his tracks. There was a human in the nursery. The human researcher. She was asleep, leaning against a platform. And the cubs, the three most important cubs in the entire empire, were sleeping on her, touching her, trusting her. Thelrix's training warred with his disbelief. This was impossible. Cubs did not do this. They did not curl up peacefully with strangers. They certainly did not fall asleep on aliens from unknown species. His hand moved to his communicator, signaling the rest of his team. Within seconds, 7 more guards entered the nursery. They all stopped. They all stared. One of the younger guards made a choking sound. Another's ears went flat against his head. Thelrix felt his own tail start to tremble, something it had not done since he was a cub himself. Because what they were seeing was not just impossible, it was everything they had secretly wished they could do for 3 long years. Commander Thelrix stood frozen, his mind racing through protocols. An unauthorized person was in direct contact with the Imperial Cubs. This was a security breach of the highest level. He should immediately remove the intruder, secure the cubs, and call for medical examination. But he could not move. None of his guards could move. They were all staring at something they had never seen before. The cubs were peaceful. Their ears were relaxed, tilted slightly forward. Their paws were loose, claws sheathed. Their tails were curled gently around themselves and the human. Every sign of their body language screamed safety and contentment. In 3 years of guarding these cubs, Thelrix had never seen them like this. They were always tense, always alert, always ready to defend themselves against perceived threats. Even when they slept, which was rare, they twitched and startled at the smallest sound. But now they slept deeply, their breathing slow and even. One of them, the smallest with silver fur, had its paw resting on the human's hand. As if holding on. As if afraid to let go, Commander, one of his guards whispered. What do we do? Thelrix's training finally kicked in. Secure the perimeter. No one else enters. I need a medical team on standby and a direct link to the Imperial Council. Do it quietly. Do not wake them. The guard nodded and slipped back outside. Thelrix took a careful step closer, then another. His team fanned out around him, surrounding the sleeping group but maintaining a respectful distance. Up close, it was even more remarkable. The human woman was small by Velrothi standards. Her skin was smooth and soft-looking, completely unlike their fur. She had no claws, no fangs, nothing that would help her defend herself against a cub attack. She was, by all measures, fragile and defenseless, and yet the cubs trusted her completely. One of the cubs stirred slightly in its sleep. It made a small sound, something between a chirp and a purr. The human's hand moved without her waking, gently stroking the cub's fur. The cub settled immediately, burrowing closer to her warmth. Thelrix felt something break inside his chest. It was a small sound, a tiny gesture, but it spoke of a care and gentleness that he had been forbidden to show for 3 years. Another guard made a choking sound. Thelrix glanced over and saw tears streaming down the warrior's face. The guard was staring at the cubs with an expression of pure anguish. They're so small, the guard whispered. We've been watching them suffer for so long. Control yourself, Thelrix said, but his own voice was rough. He felt the moisture gathering in his own eyes and tried to blink it away. He was an elite guard, he was a commander. He did not cry. But another guard had already fallen to his knees, his shoulders shaking. Then another. The hardened warriors who had served in combat, who had faced death without flinching, were breaking down at the sight of 3 peacefully sleeping cubs, because they had always known. Deep down, beneath all the protocols and traditions, they had always known the cubs needed this. Needed touch, needed comfort, needed someone to hold them when they were afraid, and they had not been allowed to give it. Thelrix's communicator buzzed softly. He stepped away to take the call, keeping his voice low. "This is Commander Thelrix. Commander, this is Central Security. We received your alert. What is the nature of the emergency? How did he even explain this? There is an unauthorized person in the nursery. The human researcher, Dr. Chen. She has made direct physical contact with the cubs. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Are the cubs injured? Has there been an attack? No, the cubs they are unharmed. They are sleeping. The confusion was evident in the security officer's voice. With an unvetted alien? Yes. Commander, forgive me, but I do not understand. Are you requesting a medical team for injuries or not? Have medical standing by. But also notify the Imperial Council immediately. They need to see this. Within 15 minutes, the nursery was surrounded by silent activity. Medical teams waited in the corridor. Security officers set up a perimeter, and members of the Imperial Council arrived one by one, summoned from their beds by an emergency that no one quite understood. Kortvan was among them. He entered the nursery and stopped dead, his ears flattening in shock. By the ancestors, what has she done? She entered during the evacuation, Thelrix explained quietly. The cubs were distressed by the alarms. She appears to have calmed them. And then she fell asleep. She fell asleep next to the Imperial cubs? Kortvan's tail lashed in agitation. They should have killed her. They should have attacked the moment she entered. But they did not, said a new voice. Everyone turned. The Empress herself stood in the doorway. She was tall and regal, with golden fur that seemed to glow in the soft light. Her expression was unreadable as she looked at the scene before her. Thelrix and his guards immediately dropped to one knee, fists over their hearts. The Empress waved a hand dismissively. Rise, I am not here for ceremonies. She walked closer, her eyes fixed on the cubs. Her cubs, the smallest one, the silver cub, was her daughter. The other 2 were her sons. She had given birth to them, nursed them for the traditional 3 months, and then handed them over to the caretakers as law demanded. She had not held them since. That had been 3 years ago. Now she stood looking at her children sleeping peacefully in the arms of an alien. One of the cubs shifted, moving closer to the human's warmth. The human murmured something in her sleep and adjusted her position, cradling the cub more securely. The Empress made a sound that was not quite a sob. They are so peaceful. Yes, Your Majesty, Thelrix said softly. I have never seen them like this. In all the recordings, all the reports, they are always agitated, always stressed. The Empress took another step closer. What did she do to them? As far as we can determine, Your Majesty, she simply sat with them, spoke to them, touched them gently, and they responded. But cubs do not respond this way. They are supposed to be aggressive, defensive. That is why we maintain distance, to protect ourselves and to teach them strength. No one answered. What could they say? The evidence was right in front of them. Everything they believed about cubs, everything their culture had practiced for thousands of years, was being challenged by a sleeping human and 3 peaceful children. Kortvan stepped forward. Your Majesty, we should remove the human now. We need to examine the cubs, ensure they have not been harmed by this contact. Harmed? The Empress turned to look at him. Look at them, Kortvan. Look at their vitals on the monitors. Their stress levels are lower than they have been in months. Their heart rates are perfect. They are healthier now than they have been since separation. But the protocols. The Empress's voice was flat. Yes, the ancient protocols that we follow without question. She looked back at the cubs. I gave birth to them. I felt them move inside me. I nursed them. And then I gave them to strangers who wear armor to touch them. Because that is what we have always done. The room was silent. Everyone could hear the emotion in the Empress's voice, see the tension in her tale. It was rare to see any emotion from the imperial family. They were trained from birth to maintain perfect control. But right now, looking at her children, the Empress was just a mother. Sarah began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, still heavy with sleep. She looked down at the warm bundles pressed against her and smiled slightly. Then her brain caught up with her eyes. She saw where she was, what she was holding, and the 8 armed guards standing in a circle around her. Her eyes went wide. The cubs felt her sudden tension and made small questioning sounds. Sarah looked at them, then at the guards, then at what could only be the Empress based on her presence and bearing. "Oh no," Sarah whispered. One of the guards standing behind her had tears streaming down his face. Another had his fist pressed against his mouth, trying to contain his emotion. Commander Thelric stood with his shoulders shaking, his own eyes wet. "How?" Thelric asked, his voice breaking on the word. "How did you survive?" "They should have torn you apart." Sarah looked down at the cubs, who were now waking up and blinking sleepily. "They're just babies," she said simply. "They were scared." "They have not slept like that," the Empress said quietly, "since the day I handed them to the caretakers." Sarah saw the pain in the Empress's eyes. She understood then what she was seeing in these hardened warriors. It was not anger at her breach of protocol. It was grief, old deep grief that had been locked away for years. "You knew," Sarah said softly. "You all knew they needed this." "Knowing and being allowed to act are different things," Thelric replied. His voice was rough. "We stand guard. We watch them suffer, and we are not permitted to help. Because that is tradition." The smallest cub, the silver one, chirped and reached up to pat Sarah's face with a soft paw. Sarah smiled despite her fear and gently held the small paw. "Hello, little one." The Empress stepped forward until she was standing right beside them. She looked down at her daughter, touching the human with such trust. "Will you show us?" she asked. "Will you show us what we have forgotten?" Sarah looked up at her. "I did not do anything special. I just gave them what any young creature needs: touch, comfort, someone to hold them when they are afraid." "We call that weakness," Kortvan said. "We call it love," Sarah replied. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Love. The Velrothi around Sarah shifted uncomfortably. It was not a word they used often, especially not in connection with child rearing. Cubs were raised with discipline, structure, and strength. Those were the values that mattered, or so they had always believed. The Empress crouched down slowly, bringing herself closer to eye level with Sarah. Up close, she was even more imposing. But there was something vulnerable in her eyes as she looked at her children. "Can you show me?" she asked quietly. "Show me what you did?" Sarah hesitated. She was still terrified. She had violated every protocol, entered a restricted area, and touched the most important children in the Empire without permission. She could be arrested, expelled from the planet, or worse. But the Empress was asking, and those cubs were snuggled against her like she was the safest thing in their world. "It's not complicated," Sarah said softly. She gently stroked the silver cub's head, her fingers moving slowly through the soft fur. "Young mammals need physical contact. It regulates their nervous system, makes them feel safe. See how her ears are relaxed? How her breathing is slow and steady? That's what calm looks like." The Empress watched intently. One of her sons crawled forward, moving toward his mother. He made a small chirping sound. The Empress froze, her hand hovering in the air between them. "It's okay," Sarah encouraged. "He wants you to touch him. See how he's presenting his head? He wants to be petted. But the aggression protocols, he's not aggressive. He's a baby asking his mother for affection." Sarah kept her voice gentle but firm. "Try it, just gently on his head." The Empress's hand trembled as she reached out. Her fingers made contact with her son's fur. The cub immediately pressed into the touch, purring loudly. The sound seemed to shock everyone in the room. "They purr?" one of the guards asked in disbelief. "Of course they purr," Sarah said. "They're happy. When was the last time any of you heard that sound?" No one answered. Because none of them ever had. The cubs in the recordings did not purr. They hissed, they cried, they made distressed sounds. But purring? That was not in any of the reports. The Empress's other hand came up, now holding her son more confidently. She drew him close to her chest. The cub climbed up and nuzzled against her neck, still purring. Tears began rolling down the Empress's face, matting the fur on her cheeks. "My baby," she whispered. "My little one." Commander Thelric watched this and felt something inside him break completely. He had served the Empire for 20 years. He had fought in wars, commanded troops, earned decorations for bravery. And he was crying like a cub himself because his Empress was holding her child for the first time in 3 years. "Commander," Sarah said gently, drawing his attention. She was holding the other two cubs still. "Would you like to hold one?" His training screamed at him. He was a guard. He maintained distance. He did not interact with the cubs beyond security protocols. But Sarah was looking at him with such understanding in her eyes, and the cub in her right arm was reaching toward him, making soft sounds. His voice failed him. "It's okay," Sarah said. "He won't hurt you, and I promise it won't make you weak. It will just make you connected." Thelrix knelt down. Sarah carefully passed him the cub, showing him how to support the small body. The moment the cub was in his arms, it climbed up his chest and pressed its face against his neck. The purring started immediately. Thelrix had faced enemy fire without flinching. He had stared down threats that would terrify most civilians. But holding this small, trusting life against his chest, he completely broke down. His shoulders shook with sobs. The cub just held on, purring louder as if trying to comfort him back. 3 years, Thelrix choked out. 3 years we stood outside that door and listened to them cry. We knew they needed this. But the protocols said we could not. That it would make them weak. "Look at him," Sarah said softly. "Does he look weak to you?" The cub was holding on to Thelrix with perfect trust, completely vulnerable and completely safe. And there was a strength in that trust, a courage in that vulnerability that none of them had expected. One by one, Sarah invited the other guards forward. Each one held a cub. Each one broke down. These were hardened warriors who had seen the worst the galaxy could offer. And they wept like children themselves as they finally understood what they had been denying these cubs. Kortvan watched from the doorway, his expression troubled. "This is not our way," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We have raised cubs like this for 3,000 years. It has made us strong, has it?" The Empress looked at him, still holding her son. "Or has it made us afraid? Afraid to feel? Afraid to connect? Afraid to show weakness even when weakness is actually courage? Your Majesty, I must protest. If we change our ways based on one incident with an alien, then we should examine why an alien understood our cubs better than we did." The Empress stood, still cradling her son. "I want the archives opened. All of them. The old ones from before the warrior reforms." Kortvan's ears flicked back. "Your Majesty, those archives are sealed for a reason. They represent a time when we were weak, before we became the empire we are today. Then it is time we looked at our history honestly." The Empress's voice held the ring of command. "I want scholars, physicians, and psychologists assembled. I want to know why we started this practice and what we have lost by maintaining it." Over the next few days, the palace transformed into a center of frantic research. Sarah found herself at the center of it all, no longer a simple observer but an active consultant. She met with Velrothi doctors and child development specialists, explaining basic principles of mammalian bonding and early childhood development. The scholars who examined the old archives came back with startling findings. Ancient Velrothi art showed parents holding cubs. There were sculptures of families intertwined, cubs clinging to their parents. There were poems about the joy of a cub's first purr, the comfort of small paws against skin. And then, about 3,000 years ago, everything changed. The Velrothi had been going through a period of war and conquest. A military leader named Thakran had reformed their entire culture around warrior values. Physical affection was declared a weakness. Cubs were to be hardened from birth, separated from their parents, raised by the state to be soldiers. It had won them wars. It had built their empire. But it had also created generations of Velrothi who grew up learning that love was weakness, that connection was danger, that to need someone was to fail. "We broke ourselves," the Empress said quietly as she reviewed the findings. She was in her private chambers with Sarah and a small group of advisors. One of her cubs, her daughter, was sleeping in her lap. The Empress had not let her children out of her sight since that first day. "We broke ourselves and called it strength." Sarah stroked the sleeping cub's head gently. "The brain research from my people might help. Young mammals need touch to develop properly. Without it, stress hormones stay elevated. The parts of the brain that handle emotional regulation do not develop correctly. It is not just emotional. It is physical brain development." A Velrothi physician checked his data pad. "That would explain the aggression we see in cubs. They are not naturally aggressive. They are responding to chronic stress." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "You have been raising cubs in conditions that keep them in constant fight-or-flight mode. Of course they seem dangerous. You have made them that way. The room fell silent. It was a harsh truth, but it was truth nonetheless. Kortvan, who had been resistant from the start, spoke up. Even if this is all true, we cannot simply change 3,000 years of tradition overnight. The people will not accept it. They will say we are being corrupted by alien influence. Then we show them, the Empress said firmly. We document everything. The cubs' health improvements, their behavior changes, their development. We show our people what their cubs can be when they are raised with love instead of fear. And that was what they did. Over the next 6 months, the palace became the center of a massive study. The Imperial cubs were raised with a new protocol, one that included regular physical contact, responsive caregiving, and emotional warmth. Their development was monitored carefully and compared against historical data. The results were striking. The cubs' stress hormones normalized within 2 weeks. Their sleep patterns improved dramatically. The aggressive behaviors that had always been considered normal simply disappeared. They still had energy and spunk, still played and tested boundaries as all young creatures do, but they were not attacking their caregivers or living in constant fear. More importantly, they were happy. They explored their environment with confidence. They learned faster. They bonded with their caregivers and with each other. They became, in short, exactly what cubs should be. Commander Thelrix and his elite guard were retrained as nurturers instead of distant watchers. At first it was awkward for these warriors to learn gentleness, but they adapted quickly. It turned out that the discipline and dedication that made them good soldiers also made them excellent caregivers. Thelrix found himself rocking a distressed cub at 3 a.m, humming an old battle song that had become a lullaby. As the cub settled against his chest, purring softly, he realized that this was harder than combat. It required more courage to be vulnerable, to let yourself care than it ever did to face enemy fire. I thought I was sure. Sarah stood in her quarters, packing her belongings into travel cases. It had been 1 year since the night she fell asleep in the nursery. 1 year since everything changed. Now it was time for her to go home. Earth had been sending messages for months congratulating her on her unexpected impact on Velrathi society. Her report on Velrathi child-rearing had become the most widely read xenological paper in human history. Universities wanted her to speak. Governments wanted her advice. Everyone wanted to know how one woman had accidentally reformed an entire alien culture. But Sarah did not feel like a hero. She felt like someone who had simply done what was obvious and kind. The cubs had been crying. She had comforted them. Everything else had followed from that simple act. There was a soft chime at her door. "Come in," she called. Commander Thelrix entered and Sarah smiled. He looked different than he had a year ago. His shoulders were more relaxed. His tail moved freely instead of being held rigid. He carried himself with the same discipline, but there was a warmth there now that had not existed before. "Dr. Chen," he greeted her formally, but his eyes were kind. "I came to escort you to the farewell ceremony." "Is that today?" "I thought it was tomorrow." "It was moved up." The Empress insisted. Thelrix helped her close one of her cases. The cubs wanted to say goodbye properly. They have been practicing their speeches all week. Sarah felt her eyes sting with tears. They did not have to do that. Try telling them that, especially the princess. She has been very bossy about the whole thing. Sarah laughed. The little silver cub, whose formal name was Princess Villana, had indeed become quite bossy as she grew older and more confident. Sarah had watched her transform from a frightened, stressed baby into a bright, curious, stubborn 4-year-old who had opinions about everything. They walked through the palace corridors together. Sarah had learned all the routes now. She could navigate the building without getting lost, understood the protocols without having to think about them. This place had become familiar, almost like home. "How are things going with the new programs?" she asked Thelrix as they walked. "Very well. We now have contact comfort protocols implemented in 80% of nurseries across the home world. The other worlds are following. Resistance is fading as parents see the results." He paused at an intersection to let a group of palace workers pass. "There have been challenges, of course. Many adults do not know how to be affectionate because they were never shown affection themselves. We are having to teach an entire generation how to love their children. That must be hard. It is the most important work I have ever done." Thelrix's voice was quiet but firm. "I was raised the old way. I grew up believing that needing others was weakness. I have spent the past year on learning that. Learning to ask for help. Learning to admit when I am struggling. Learning that connection is not a liability but a strength. They entered a large ceremonial hall. It had been decorated with both Velrothi and human symbols, acknowledging the blending of cultures that had occurred. At the center of the room stood the Empress with her 3 cubs, now grown into young children. Around them were gathered members of the Imperial Court, the Elite Guard, and representatives from across Velrothi space. When Sarah entered, everyone turned to look at her. Then, in a gesture that was highly unusual for the formal Velrothi, they began to applaud. The sound echoed through the hall. Sarah felt her face flush. Oh, that is really not necessary. But the applause continued. She saw tears on many faces. Guards who had wept in the nursery that first night. Physicians who had documented the cubs' recovery. Parents who had learned new ways to love their children. The Empress stepped forward and the applause faded. Dr. Sarah Chen, she said formally, you came to our world as an observer. You left as a teacher, a friend, and a savior of our children. Your Majesty, I really did not. The Empress held up a hand, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Please do not be modest. It does not suit you. You have changed our entire civilization. The least you can do is accept credit for it. The cubs rushed forward then, abandoning all protocol. Princess Velana reached Sarah first, wrapping her arms around Sarah's waist. You are leaving. I have to go home, sweetheart, Sarah said, kneeling down to be at eye level. My own family misses me. My friends want to see me. But we will miss you. Prince Taran, one of the sons, joined the embrace. So did his brother, Prince Kolvan. Soon Sarah was buried in a pile of young Velrothi, all holding on tight. I will miss you too, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. But you have your mother now. You have your guards. You have so many people who love you. Because you showed them how. Velana said seriously. Mama said you taught us that love is not weakness. Your mama is very wise. The Empress moved closer, gently extracting her children from Sarah. They are right, though. We will miss you terribly. You have become part of our family. You have all become part of mine, Sarah replied. The ceremony that followed was beautiful. Sarah was presented with medals, honors, and formal recognition from the Velrothi government. More importantly, she received gifts from individual families. A father gave her a blanket his cub had helped make. A mother brought a painting her son had created, showing Sarah with the imperial cubs. Each gift represented a life that had been changed, a family that had been healed. Cordovan approached near the end. He had remained skeptical for months, but eventually even he had admitted the evidence was undeniable. Dr. Chen, he said stiffly, I owe you an apology. I resisted your observations because they challenged everything I believed to be true. I was wrong. And because I was wrong, many cubs suffered for longer than necessary. You were not wrong to question, Sarah said gently. You were protecting your culture. But cultures are meant to grow and adapt. You did adapt. That takes courage, Kortvan's ears twitched in surprise. You are very kind to someone who made your work difficult. You made my work better by challenging it. I had to make sure I was right. I had to gather evidence. I had to think carefully about my recommendations. That is good science. After the ceremony, Sarah had private time with the cubs and the Empress. They sat together in the Empress's chambers, the children playing around them while the adults talked. What will you do when you return to Earth? The Empress asked. I have been asked to advise on several projects. There are other species in the coalition who have similar issues with child rearing. Some have separation practices even more extreme than yours were. If I can help, I want to. You will need support. The resistance you faced here will exist everywhere. Some species are very attached to their traditions. I know, but I also know that every species has parents who love their children. Sometimes they just need permission to show it. Velana climbed into Sarah's lap, something she still did even though she was getting too big for it. Will you come back and visit? I hope so. But even if I cannot come back for a while, we can talk through communications. I can see how much you have grown. You can tell me about your studies. I am learning to read ancient texts, Velana said proudly. Mama says I need to understand our history so I can be a good empress someday. That is very wise, and I think you will be an excellent empress. You are brave and kind and curious. Those are the best qualities a leader can have. The little princess purred, rubbing her head against Sarah's chin. I will remember what you taught us. That love is strength. Sarah hugged her close, trying to memorize the feeling, the weight of the cub in her arms, the softness of her fur, the rumble of her purr. These children had changed her life as much as she had changed theirs. When it was time to leave, Sarah walked to the landing pad where her shuttle waited. The entire Imperial Guard was there to see her off. Commander Thelric stood at attention, but when Sarah approached, he stepped forward and offered his arm in the traditional Velrothi gesture of deep respect. "Guardian of the Young," he said, using the formal title the Empress had given her. "You have taught us what we forgot. You have given us back our hearts. We will never forget." "Take care of them," Sarah said. "Take care of all the cubs. Make sure they grow up knowing they are loved. On my honor and my life," Thelrix promised. Sarah boarded the shuttle. As it lifted off, she looked down at the palace below. She could see the nursery windows, the courtyards where cubs now played freely with their parents, the gardens where families walked together. 1 year ago, she had fallen asleep in a nursery, frightened and exhausted. She had woken to find warriors crying. She had not understood then that she was watching the moment when an entire culture began to heal. The shuttle broke atmosphere, and the Velrothi homeworld became a blue-green sphere below her. Sarah touched the window, a silent goodbye to the planet that had taught her so much. Her communicator chimed with a message. It was from Thelrix, sent just as she left orbit. It contained a single image: the 3 Imperial cubs sleeping peacefully in a pile, their parents curled around them, the entire family together and safe.